Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make a bounce spline using the extra curve object add-on. The add-on comes shipped with Blender. I'll also show you how to animate the curve to create this animation here. It should be a relatively quick tutorial, it shouldn't take too long. So without further ado, let's get to it. Open up Blender, we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and then under Add-ons we're going to search for Node and then enable the Node Wrangler here. Once you've enabled that, we're going to search for Extra, and we're going to enable extra curve objects. If you can't find extra curve objects in your add-ons, go to Get Extensions and then search for Extra, and then install the extra curve objects from here. Once you've enabled those add-ons, we're going to click this button, click Save Preferences, and that will ensure the add-ons load every time you load Blender. I'll then close this window here. Select the default cube, hit Delete, Shift A, we go to Mesh, and we choose Icosphere. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. And with the icosphere selected, hit Shift A, we go Curve, we're going to go Knots, and we'll choose Bounce Spline. I'll then navigate to the bottom left and expand the Bounce Spline options down here. I'm going to change the bounces to 100. I'm going to increase the resolution to 16. And you can choose a random seed just to choose a different pattern. We can also enable X-ray view or wireframe view so we can see the pattern a bit better. And I'm just going to keep changing the seed until I've got something that I like. Maybe something like that. Excellent. I'll then collapse the bounce spline options down here. I'll then select the icosphere object and I'll hit delete. I'll select the bounce spline. I'm going to go into solid view. I'll just zoom into this object. I'll then navigate to the right to my curve data tab over here. I'll expand the geometry options. I'm going to scroll down and under bevel, I'm going to increase the depth to 0.01. I'll also increase the resolution to 2. From here, I'm going to go to my modifiers tab. We'll click Add Modifier, we go to Generate, and we'll select Subdivision Surface. I'll keep the viewport set to 1 and the render set to 2. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll click this button and change it to Timeline. I'll then take my cursor over here and I'm going to change the end frame to 480 frames. I'll just navigate to my Output tab over here. I'm going to change my frame rate to 30 FPS. And I'm also going to enable Render Region. Navigate to your Renders tab. If you're in Eevee, we're going to enable Ray Tracing. I'm going to render my final out in cycles. I'll also change my device type from CPU to GPU. Under Render, I'm going to keep my noise threshold set to 0.01. Yours will be set to 0.05 by default, I believe. I'll also change my max samples to 1024. I'm going to navigate and expand the lights options. I'm going to disable Light Tree. I'll then go to Light Paths. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to disable Reflective and Refractive Caustics. I'll just go to my timeline. I'm going to hit N to hide the end panel and I'm going to zoom in just so I can see everything in the timeline. I'll take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see the crosshair again. I'll left click and drag up and open up a new window, and I'll change this to the graph editor. I'll just hit N to hide the end panel. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to orbit round. I'm going to scroll out. I'm going to select the default light. I'm going to hit delete. I'll select the camera. I'll navigate to my Object Data tab over here, and from my camera, Location Transform on X, I'm going to set to 0. On Y, I'm going to set to -1.2, and on my Z, I'm going to set to 0. For the transform, I'm going to set the X rotation to 90 degrees, Y to 0, and Z to 0. I'll then go to my Camera Data tab down here, and I'm going to set the focal length to 8mm. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go Empty, and I'm going to choose Sphere. And with my Empty Data tab over here, I'm going to increase the size to 1.5. Ensure that you're on frame 1. We're going to select the camera. I'm going to hold down Shift, left click select the empty object. I'm going to hit Control P, and we're going to set parent to Object Keep Transform. I'll then select my empty object. I'm going to go to my Object Data tab over here, and on frame 1, we're going to set the Z rotation to 0, and we'll add a keyframe here. I'll then go to my timeline. I'm going to skip to the last frame. I'll then skip one more frame, so we're on frame 481. And in the Z rotation, I'm going to type in 360, and we'll add a keyframe here. I'll just increase my graph editor. I'll hold down Control, middle mouse button, and just drag down so I can see everything. By default, your animation interpolation type is probably set to Bezier, which should look something like this. And what a Bezier animation interpolation type will do, it will start the animation off slowly, it will start to speed up, and then it will also slow down as it gets towards the end of the animation. We don't want that. We want a constant speed. So in my graph editor, I'm going to hit A couple of times until I've got all my keyframes selected. I'll then hit T and we'll choose linear. So now if I hit play, you can see that we've got a constant speed. Excellent. I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'm going to select the bounce spline. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate that object. I'll hit escape to lock it back in its original location. I'll then go to my outliner. I'm going to mute the original bounce spline. I'll ensure that I've got the duplicate bounce spline selected. I'll then navigate to the curve data tab over here. I'm going to scroll down and I'll expand the start and end mapping options. I'm going to set the end to 0 and on frame 1 with the end set to 0, I'm going to add a keyframe here. I'll then skip to frame 475 and that's 5 frames away from the end. I'll then set this end mapping to 1. I'll add a keyframe there. I'll then skip to frame 5 and for the start factor I'm going to add a keyframe there set to 0. Skip to the last frame, so we're on frame 480 and I'll change the start factor to 1 and then I'll add a keyframe there. And now if I hit play, you should see that we've got an offset. So I'm just going to select all my bounce splines. I'm going to hold down Control, middle mouse button and drag up. And I'm just going to shimmy this up until I can see the curve. Now if for some reason your bounce splines are set to Bezier, so if I hit T, if they're set to Bezier like that, just hit T and then set them to linear. And that will ensure that you've got a constant speed. If I hit play, you can see that the start and end is offset slightly, which has given this effect. And for example, if I was to just alter this end frame temporarily, you can basically see what's happening, and then we change the start frame. So we've got them offset by 5 frames, and that's why it's coming out like this. So I'm going to skip back to frame 1. I'll then hide that bounce spline in my outliner. I'm going to unhide the original bounce spline. I'll select that original bounce spline. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. I'll hit escape to lock it back in its original position. I'll then go to my outliner and hide the original bounce spline and ensure that you've got the new bounce spline selected. I'll then navigate to my curve data tab down here. I'm going to increase the factor on the start to 1. So ensure that you're on frame 1 and both of the start and end factors are set to 1. I'm going to add a keyframe on end. I'll then skip to frame 475. I'll then take this end factor and bring it all the way to 0. I'll add a keyframe here. I'll then skip to frame 5. I'll navigate to the start factor and add a keyframe there. I'll then skip to the last frame. I'll then take the start factor down to 0 and I'll add a keyframe there. In your graph editor, hit A couple of times so you've got all your keyframes selected. Hit T and then choose linear. I'll now navigate to the outliner and I'll unhide the other bounce spline, and if I hit play you can see that we've got 2 bounce splines being animated. Excellent. Navigate to your graph editor, click this button here and change it to the shader editor. Navigate to your outliner and unhide the original bounce spline. Currently these bounce splines are exactly the same size and we don't want that, so I'm going to select the second bounce spline in my outliner. I'll then navigate to the curve data tab down here. We'll navigate to the geometry section and under bevel we're going to set the depth to 0.015. I'll then hover my cursor over that value. I'm going to hit Control C to copy that value. We'll then select the second duplicate of the bounce spline. We're going to go to bevel and under depth hover your cursor over there and we'll hit Control V and that will paste that value there. And that just ensures that the duplicate bounce splines are slightly bigger than the original bounce spline. We don't want overlapping geometry. Select your original bounce spline and under your shader editor we're going to click New and that will add a new material. I'll then change it to metallic and I'm going to set the roughness to, let's say, 0.333. I'll navigate to the outliner. I'm going to select the first duplicate bounce spline. I'm going to click New, delete the principal BSDF. We'll then hit Shift A. We're going to go to shader and I'm going to choose emission. I'll then connect the emission socket to the surface socket of the material output. I'm going to set the strength to, let's say, 5 and I'm going to change the color to orange. I'll just hit N to hide the end panel. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to go shader and I'm going to choose mix shader and I'll pop that in between the emission and the material output. Shift A. I'm going to go shader and I'm going to choose metallic BSDF and I'll pop that down here. Maybe I'll just increase this window slightly. I'm going to reduce the roughness to 0. I'll then connect the metallic BSDF into the bottom socket of the mix shader. I'll then hit Shift A. We go to input and we'll choose layer weight. I'll connect the facing socket into the factor socket of the mix shader and I'm going to set the blend to 0.8. I'll now box select all of these nodes here. I'll then hold down Shift, left click select the layer weight node a couple of times until it's highlighted. I'll then hit Control C to copy those nodes to the clipboard. I'll then navigate to my outliner and I'll select the final duplicate of the bounce spline. I'll go to my shader editor, click new to add a new material. I'll select the principal BSDF. I'm going to hit delete. I'll then hit Control V and that will paste those nodes in there. I'll connect the shader socket to the surface socket of the material output, and I'm going to change the emission color to blue, maybe something around there perhaps. Excellent. I'm going to hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'm just going to scrub my timeline to ensure the camera's not going to clip with the object. Okay, it's looking quite good so far. I think I want my camera to be a bit closer to the bounce spline. So I'm going to take my camera, I'm going to go to my object data tab over here, and I'm going to reduce the Y location to, let's say, -1. Let's see what that looks like. Now you see, we're getting these clipping artifacts here. That's an easy enough fix. We just go to our camera data tab down here, and under clip start, I'm going to hold down shift and left click and drag, and that should fix that problem. I think the camera's probably a bit close to the bounce spline, so I'm going to go back to my object data tab over here. I'm going to hold down shift and just drag these values a bit, maybe something around there perhaps. I'll then scrub my timeline just to make sure that the camera's not going to intersect with any of these splines. Okay, so I don't like the way the spline just ends in the camera view here, so I'm going to select this spline. I'll go to my outliner, I'm going to hold down Control, Shift and then left click select the last spline. So we've got all of them selected. Tab into edit mode. I'm going to select a point on that spline. I'm going to hit numpad period to zoom into that spline. Okay, so we've got it in view here. I'll then go into X-ray view and I'm just ensuring that the view isn't going to intersect with any of these other points on any other spline. I'll then box select this spline point, so we've actually got 3 points selected here for the 3 splines. I'll then hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'll then click O to go into proportional editing. You can enable it here. I'll then click this button here, ensure that you've got smooth interpolation selected, enable connected only. I'll disable X-ray view. I'll then hit G, Z, and I'm just going to bring this up to around about there. Tab out of edit mode. Before we move on, it's a good idea to save your project, so I'm going to go File, Save As, and I'm going to save my project as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then click Save As. I'm just going to disable my overlays. I'm going to click this tab here for render preview. I'll then click this button here. I'm going to choose scene lights and scene world. I'm going to go to my world settings over here and I'm going to take the strength down to 0. I'll now hit play to preview the animation. Yours should look something similar to this. And as it ends and restarts, it should loop seamlessly. Excellent. So I'm just going to go into rendered preview. Just going to skip to a random frame. That frame will do. I'll then go into solid view. I'm going to enable my overlays. I'm going to hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, that's an acceptable result, but I think we can bump up the emission for this one. So I'm just going to hit escape. I'm going to select the second bounce spline in my outliner. I'm going to bump up the strength on the emission to 10. I'll then select the third bounce spline in my outliner and I'm going to pump up the emission on this one to 10. I think this scene could benefit from motion blur. I'll navigate to my render tab over here. I'm going to scroll down until I see motion blur. I'll enable motion blur. I'll expand these options. The correct formula for motion blur is your shutter speed should be double the amount of your frame rate. So my frame rate is set to 30 frames per second, which means my shutter speed should be set to 0.6 because 2 times 30 is 6. So if you're running at 25 frames per second, for example, then your shutter speed should be 0.50. Because 25 times 2 is 50. I'll hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, I think this render could benefit from a bit of fog glow, so I'm going to hit escape to close that window. I'll then navigate to my compositing tab up here. I'm going to enable use nodes. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel, navigate to the N panel. I'm going to click this view tab here, enable backdrop. I'm going to decrease my timeline. I'll then click fit, hit N to close the N panel. I'm going to box select my render layers. I'm going to hit G, just move it across to give us a bit more room. Shift A, I'm going to go filter and I'm going to choose glare and I'll pop that in between the render layers and the composite. I'm going to change it from streaks to fog glow. I'm going to reduce the strength to, let's say, 0.5 and maybe I'll reduce the size to 0.25. So with my glare node selected, I'm just going to hit M to mute it just to see the difference. I'll hit M again to unmute. So it just adds a tiny bit of glow. Excellent. I'll navigate back to my layout view. I'll navigate to my render tab up here. If you want to speed up your render times, you can either reduce your max samples or increase your noise threshold. I might actually set mine to 0.025, just so it renders in a reasonable amount of time. Alternatively, you can choose EV, just to ensure that you've got ray tracing enabled. But for mine, I'm going to choose cycles. I'll then navigate to my output tab over here. I'm going to scroll down, click this folder, and then select the file location where you want to save your image sequence. I'm going to save mine in a folder called like and subscribe. I'll then click accept. Choose a file format. If you're going with PNG, go for RGB. 8-bit or 16-bit will be fine, but for me, I'm going to choose a file format of OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will reduce my file size whilst increasing dynamic range for post-production. I'll then hit Ctrl S to save the project, and then it's simply a case of hitting Ctrl F12, and that will render out your image sequence. Join me on Patreon as a free member and you'll have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click hype, like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.